The year was 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a silent witness to one of the most brutal wars mankind had ever seen. Across those waters, the soldiers of the Empire of Japan waited, proud, disciplined, ready to die for their emperor. They had conquered lands from China to the Philippines, from Malaya to the islands of the Pacific. Their flag, the rising sun, flew over territories where no foreign power dared to challenge them. But soon from the east came a storm wearing green uniforms, landing from the sea and shouting a word that would echo in Japanese nightmares for years to come. Marines! The beginning of fear, to understand why the Japanese grew to hate fighting the American Marines more than any other unit. We must go back to the early days of the Pacific War, to the islands where both sides first met in blood. The Imperial Japanese Army was no stranger to war. They had crushed the Russians in 1905, marched through China in the 1930s, and believed no Western power could match their discipline or spirit. They saw themselves as modern samurai, warriors guided by Bushido, the way of the warrior. To die for the emperor was the highest honor. To surrender was a disgrace. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they believed America would crumble, that a soft, materialistic nation could not endure a long war. They were wrong, because America had its own warrior code, not ancient, not spiritual, but forged in fire. The code of the United States Marine Corps, Guadalcanal, the first clash August 1942, the Solomon Islands, a humid jungle buzzing with insects drenched in rain and fear. The Marines landed on Guadalcanal, their first major offensive of the war. They were young, many barely out of high school, but trained to perfection. Their mission? Seize the island's airfield and hold it, no matter the cost. Across the jungle, the Japanese commander, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, watched in disbelief. He had been told the Americans were weak. He called them decadent cowards. So, under the cover of night, he gathered his men, nearly 1,000 strong, and prepared a glorious banzai charge. When the moon rose, the jungle erupted in shouts of "Ten Oheka Banzai! Long live the Emperor!" The Japanese stormed forward, bayonets fixed, confident they would crush the Americans in one swift blow. But the Marines were waiting. Their lines were dug deep behind the Tenaru River, machine guns locked, mortars loaded. They let the Japanese come close enough to see their faces, and then unleashed hell. Fire, metal, and blood filled the night. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers fell, cut down before they could even reach the Marines' line. The banzai charge turned into slaughter. By dawn, the battlefield was silent. Of Ichiki's 917 men, fewer than 130 survived. The colonel, humiliated and broken, committed seppuku, suicide by sword. The Japanese high command could hardly believe the reports. How could their best men be destroyed by Americans? But the survivors knew the truth. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were Marines. From that moment, the Japanese began to hate them, not just for their victory, but for what they represented. An enemy who fought with their same spirit, but in a different uniform. The birth of a legend for the Marines. Guadalcanal was the beginning of a long, bloody road across the Pacific. For the Japanese, it was the birth of a nightmare. They learned that wherever the Marines went, islands fell. The hatred grew not from propaganda, but from repetition, defeat after defeat, landing after landing. To understand that hatred, we must understand what the Marines brought to every battle. They did not fight for land or empire. They fought for each other, for the man beside them in the mud, the brother who would never leave them behind. Their motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful, was more than words. It was a promise that echoed through every jungle, every beach, every foxhole. The Japanese soldiers began to whisper about these green demons who came from the sea. They said the Marines could not be killed, that they advanced no matter how many fell. They were not afraid of death, only of failure. To the Japanese, this was unthinkable. An enemy who fought without surrender, who refused to be broken. It was like fighting a reflection of themselves, the Battle of Tarawa, the island that shouldn't fall. November 1943, the Gilbert Islands. a speck of coral and sand in the middle of the Pacific. To the Japanese, it was impregnable. To the Marines, it was a test. Baitio Atoll was barely 2 miles long, but fortified with bunkers, barbed wire, and thousands of defenders. The Japanese commander boasted, "1 million men cannot take this island in 100 years." He was wrong. The Marines did it in 76 hours. The bombardment began with thunder. Battleships and cruisers unleashed a storm that turned coral into dust. Then, as the guns fell silent, landing craft surged toward the beaches. But the tide was low. The boats ran aground hundreds of yards from shore, forcing the Marines to wade through waist-deep water, fully exposed to Japanese fire. Machine guns tore them apart. Bodies floated in the surf. The lagoon turned crimson, and yet they kept coming. One Marine later wrote, "I saw men die standing up, shot to pieces, but they didn't fall. They just kept walking until the sea swallowed them. By the end of the battle, 4,800 Japanese were dead. Only 17 were taken alive. The Japanese survivors sent reports to Tokyo describing the Americans as inhuman, men who walked through fire. From that moment on, the very word Marine became a symbol of dread in the Japanese army. They no longer saw them as mere soldiers, but as a force of nature, a storm from the sea that could not be stopped." Clash of cultures. Why did the Japanese hate the Marines more than any other unit? Because the Marines destroyed their deepest belief, that Japan alone held the spirit of the warrior. In Japanese military schools, recruits were taught that Western soldiers were weak, afraid of pain, and quick to surrender. They believed the Americans relied on machines, not spirit. But every battle against the Marines proved the opposite. Marines fought with savage discipline. They used their firepower with precision, but they also fought hand-to-hand, face-to-face. They charged into bunkers, cleared caves, and held the line when others would retreat. The Japanese respected courage, and they saw too much of it in the Marines. It was a mirror that reflected their own ideals: loyalty, courage, sacrifice, but twisted into the hands of their enemy. Saipan. Tinian Peleliu. The empire crumbles in 1944. The tide turned completely. The Americans began their island-hopping campaign, skipping weaker islands and striking the strongholds head-on. And every time, the Marines led the charge. On Saipan, 30,000 Japanese soldiers faced the Marines. The fighting was savage. Civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. When defeat was certain, the Japanese commander, General Saito, ordered one final charge, the largest banzai attack of the war. 3,000 men stormed into the Marine lines. By dawn, nearly all of them were dead. A captured Japanese diary read, "We were told the Americans feared death, but the Marines did not. They fought even when surrounded. They shouted as they killed us with eyes that burned. On Peleliu, the heat reached 120 degrees. The island was only 6 miles long, yet it consumed thousands of lives. Japanese soldiers hid in caves, refusing to die easily. The Marines burned them out with flamethrowers, grenade by grenade, inch by inch. When the battle ended, the island was silent. No trees, no birds, only ash and bone. Each victory fed the hatred. To the Japanese, the Marines were not human. They were the heralds of defeat. Everywhere they landed, Japan lost ground, honor, and hope. Iwo Jima, Hell on Earth, February 1945. A small volcanic island, black sand and smoke. Iwo Jima, the bloodiest Marine battle of the war. 21,000 Japanese soldiers waited underground, in tunnels carved into the rock. They had sworn to kill 10 Americans for every one of them who fell. The Marines landed into chaos. Every inch of the beach was under fire. Men burned alive in their tanks. Others suffocated under volcanic ash. For 36 days, the Marines fought in that hell. The Japanese refused to surrender. They fought from caves, from beneath the earth, from the shadows. At night, they crawled among the bodies, stabbing the wounded. But the Marines adapted. They fought fire with fire, digging them out, blowing up the tunnels, sealing them shut. The cost was unbearable. 26,000 Marine casualties. But they never retreated. When the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi, the Japanese radioed Tokyo. The enemy has planted his flag on our sacred soil. To them, it was the ultimate humiliation. That image, 5 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman raising the stars and stripes, became legend. To the Japanese, it was a symbol of despair. To the world, it was the face of victory. The hatred burned hotter than ever. But beneath it, even Japanese officers admitted privately, they fight like we do. They are soldiers of true spirit. Okinawa, the final storm, April 1945, the last great battle. Okinawa, the doorstep to Japan itself. 200,000 troops clashed in a storm of steel and fire. Marines and Army soldiers fought side by side, but once again, it was the Marines who led the amphibious assault. The Japanese fought to the death. Kamikaze pilots crashed into ships by the hundreds. Civilians, brainwashed by fear, leapt off cliffs, clutching their children. The Marines saw the full horror of war and pushed on. When the battle ended, Okinawa was a wasteland. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. The Marines had lost thousands more. But Japan was finished. And with that defeat came the end of their empire and the end of their hatred. The roots of hatred. So why in the end did the Japanese hate fighting the Marines more than any other unit? Because the Marines were the embodiment of everything Japan thought it alone possessed: discipline, ferocity, and an unbreakable will. Because the Marines humiliated their strongest divisions, shattered their myth of invincibility, and proved that courage was not owned by one nation. Because every island the Marines touched was lost, every fortress they stormed fell, and every commander who faced them died or vanished. To the Japanese, fighting the Marines meant facing inevitability. It meant death. It meant the collapse of a dream, and yet in that hatred, there was respect. The kind only warriors can feel for one another. The aftermath when the war finally ended, and Japan lay in ruins, the surviving veterans of both sides began to speak. Some Japanese officers confessed that they had studied Marine tactics with fascination, admiring their precision and courage. Others admitted that they had prayed never to face them again. In post-war years, former enemies met again, not with weapons, but with handshakes. On the beaches of Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Saipan, old men stood side by side, heads bowed to the fallen. American Marines placed flowers on Japanese graves. Japanese veterans saluted the American memorials. The hatred that once burned in their hearts had turned into mutual respect. One Japanese soldier, now an old man, said softly at a reunion, "We hated them because they showed us what true courage was. They were our reflection and our punishment." The legacy today, decades later, the legend endures. The name Marine still carries weight in Japan, not as an insult, but as a reminder. A reminder of a time when two warrior nations collided, each testing the limits of human endurance. For the Marines, those battles defined their legacy. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, they wrote their history in blood and courage. For Japan, the Marines became the symbol of the unstoppable, the enemy who never surrendered, who never feared death, who came from the sea like fate itself. They were hated, feared, and in the end respected. Because hatred fades, but respect born from the battlefield, endures forever. They came from the ocean's horizon, roaring through smoke and fire. They landed on beaches that men said could never be taken. They fought for inches, for brothers, for honor. They buried their dead, raised their flag, and kept moving forward. The Japanese hated them because they could not defeat them. The world remembers them because they refused to be broken. They were not gods, not monsters, just men who would not stop. They were the United States Marines, and their legend was written in the blood of those who tried to stand against them.